Hi again. So another awakening. And I'm sort of thinking like some of my awakenings, you wouldn't call them specifically spiritual because we have like this overlay of like, yeah, the spiritual journey is all like, woo woo and mystical and all that sort of stuff. But we learn a lot about the world in different ways, and there's all kinds of different awakenings that we have. And so today's one, it happened when I was very young, very, very, very young. Like I'd only just begun school, and I think I was about 4.5 at this stage, maybe a dash older. And so yeah, it was called kindergarten. And anyway, so back in that time, like it was sort of just at the end point of when children could still be hit and smacked and everything if they misbehaved and everything. It began to sort of phase out and stop sort of just after I was very little. I don't recall it. It only ever happened when I was very, very young. But so I was in a kindergarten class, which is with like, 4 and 5-year-old kids, very little kids, just bubbers. And the teacher we had was old, and she was a very, very mean lady, like scary, very scary. And and so in the classroom there was like a circle painted on the floor, a big circle. And when we had group times, we'd all sit around the circle. You'd have to sit somewhere on that line of the circle. In the center of the circle, there was a dot. And you didn't want to sit on that dot, because if you were forced to sit on the dot in the center of the circle, it was because you're in trouble. So, you can imagine, like, for a little kid, you've got all of these eyes surrounding you, looking at you. You're the center of attention, and you're there because you're wrong, like, you've done something wrong. And I'm sure I landed on the dot a few times, but um, it's not about me, this one. I do recall I lived in an area that was mostly very, very white, Anglo-Saxon people. And there was a little Aboriginal girl, one of our First Nations children, who was in the class, which is kind of unusual. Like, I'd never um, seen a child of, another kid of colour at all, but it didn't bother me at all. Like, you know what I mean? I just didn't think anything of it. Like, to me, she was just another girl in the class, another person, another potential friend, and I didn't see the colour of her skin. But I did see it in this moment, because this memory is really, really distinct. I just remember us all sitting around the circle, and I don't know why, but she was on the dot in the centre. Um, and I could see she was very, very distressed and upset, and she was crying. And she was so upset she wet herself, so she's sitting in a puddle of her own urine. And I just remember, this is at the age of 4.5, looking and just sort of, I knew the teacher put her there, and I just couldn't understand why the teacher wasn't, picking her up and taking her to the toilet and cleaning her up and comforting her, like it was so obvious she was upset. And I very, very quickly worked out that she was there purely because of the colour of her skin. I realise it's got nothing to do with what she's done. She's being victimised. She might have done something very small or whatever that any one of us could have done, but I knew she was being punished because of the colour of her skin. And it was, yeah, a real shock. And then I do have a sense of, like, all the other kids around me, and you know, I did have a sense, not all, but there were some children who they knew because, they're sitting on the outside. They were sort of, I could see them adjusting their mindset so that they knew that they had to look down on that girl too. I could tell they, thinking, oh, she's done something wrong and looking in that way. Other kids were confused and, but there was just a couple. I could just tell a couple of those other kids, like, their minds were probably being changed. Either they'd been influenced at home, or in that moment they were being influenced because they didn't want to be the child in the middle of the circle, and they knew that, it's got something to do with the color of her skin, like she's wrong, she's bad. So it was just, I suppose you could call it a rather rude awakening, that people are treated differently because of how they look, um, how they appear, and um, and also, that would include also people of, with intellectual disabilities, with physical disabilities. I do recall observing how, there were other children who had to go to special schools. And so, again, like, they're pushed off and they're separated and they're different. They're not the same. They're not as capable as you are. And yeah, yeah. So I just began to sort of make sense of, like, oh, this world, like, what the world I was living in, that there was this attitude of us and them. And I knew that the color of my skin, I can't say I actually conceived that it meant that white is better. But I knew I wasn't going to be judged for that, for the color of my skin. I, I, I did, yeah, I could work that much out. I knew that I wouldn't be put on that dot in the center of the circle because I got blonde hair and, I'm white and everything. Um, but I didn't see that made me better. I just saw it sort of made me immune in a way. Um, so it was the beginnings of starting to make sense of the sort of society, the sort of world this is. And children don't see this, and I still don't see it. I don't see difference. I see the difference, like, like with my physical senses, I can see difference, but it doesn't make any difference to me inside. Um, yeah, it's just people are people, like, yeah, there's no difference in that way. Um, so thus concludes my latest little sharing of awakenings. Enjoy.